On Christmas night, my daughter-in-law slipped something into my drink, so I switched glasses. That sentence sounds dramatic until you stand in the middle of a room full of relatives, the scent of pine and roasted ham hanging in the air, and realize the drama is happening in real time, with a champagne flute in your hand and polite laughter all around. It was the sort of party you stage because you can. A small celebration for the sale of a business, a nod to friends who had been partners, and a family that had fed you patience when you needed it. The lights were low, the tree sparkled, and I had chosen that one glass, the chipped one I kept for luck, because sometimes superstition tastes better than crystal. I noticed Jessica without looking, like someone notices a shadow at the edge of the room. She was supposed to be helping in the kitchen. Instead, she had drifted back toward the living room, a hand casually resting on the back of a chair. Her nails were immaculate, painted a red that matched the stockings, heels clicking in a way that made you hear only them. She watched me for a moment, the way a poker player watches a rival for tells. Then she reached into her clutch, produced a tiny vial so discreet it could have been a perfume sample, and tilted it toward my glass. I feel the moment now as if it freezes in snow globe motion. The tilt, the glint of the glass catching light, the way her wrist turned like a practiced bar hand. My stomach dropped, not with fear so much as recognition. I have spent my life learning to read people the way others read balance sheets. Numbers lie less than smiles. That vial wasn't water. The hand that held it belonged to someone with a purpose. She made it look casual. She made it look like nothing. Nobody noticed because at Christmas you assume the worst is boring. I did not move, not at first. I do not like scenes. I had raised 2 children in a house that never stopped needing something, and later built a company that demanded my attention at odd hours. Confrontation has rarely been my first language. Planning has been. So I watched, and with the same small, careful motions I had used to switch vendors during a hostile takeover, I slid my glass away and set it down at the end table. The chipped lip, the tiny star of a flaw where the light caught. My good luck glass. I handed it to Helen. Helen had come with Jessica, her mother, a small, spry one in with a laugh like a hinge that needed oiling. She loved the punch bowl and had a habit of commenting on everything from the roast to the napkin fold. I handed her my glass as one might hand a colleague a file in the middle of a meeting. No fanfare, no accusation. The substitution was a quiet, almost embarrassed courtesy. I smiled, the practiced smile that comes with being a woman who has closed deals and mended fences. Jessica's face slipped for a fraction of a second when she realized she had been seen, then smoothed into something practiced. The vial disappeared back into her clutch, as if it had never existed. If you want to hear the whole story, subscribe. That is, if you want to see how the chess moves were made. For now, stay with me through this first uneasy move. I tell you this because there are 2 ways to react when a loved one hands you malice. One is to shout, to spill the secret across the room and watch the immediate eruption. The other is to remember how to live long enough to use the law like a scalpel. I had spent the better part of 40 years reading contracts, parsing risk, and turning uncomfortable truths into manageable liabilities. It's a habit that sticks. Helen drank that champagne. By 9:30, she was on the floor. I will not paint her collapse in glorious detail. She rose from her seat, a small sound escaping her throat, then sank without the flair of melodrama. No cinematic convulsions, no blood. Just the bewildered confusion of a woman who had no idea the world had shifted under her feet. People gathered. Someone shouted for water. Jessica. I watched her again, because watching was the only honest thing I could do. She was overwhelmed in the way people act when they must be very upset and must not show it. Michael, my son, moved as if pulled on a string. His face was ashen, but his hands trembled in a way I recognized from times when he adrenaline rushed through numbers and panic. That same panicked ignorance he wore when credit cards were overdue and the mortgage people were polite but insistent. The ambulance came. The lights in the street were shards. Helen went to the hospital, and we were left in the living room with the dull hum of the music someone had the decency to switch off. I remember thinking of my grandmother in that moment, the woman who taught me how to sew a hymn and how to survive a bad year. She would have been furious at me if she knew I did not storm out and grab Jessica by the collar. She would have told me to light a fire under the whole lot of them. I thought of that, and then I thought of strategy. There is dignity in method. At the hospital, The initial medical staff were careful, businesslike. They hooked Helen up to monitors and said words like observe and rule out and make no assumptions. You learn to read such phrases as lawyers and executives learn to read market reports. They are hedges against liability. The doctor, a young man with a tired tie, suggested a panel of tests. I nodded. I asked to see Helen's personal effects, because in situations like this, small things are often big things. A report arrived, and the word inconclusive appeared with a kind of bureaucratic calm. They called it inconclusive. I called it the least surprising thing I could imagine. You should know something about me. I have never relied on a single truth to protect myself. When I sold my company, I did not hand all the proceeds to fate and hope. I put my finances where they could not be moved without someone else noticing the motion. I kept records. I kept a lawyer whose face I knew and who knew the way I liked things done. I paid attention to small numbers the same way I paid attention to small movements in a room. You can't be 70 years old in this world and expect kindness to be your armor. My armor was paperwork and attentiveness. That night, I made 2 calls. One was to David Hartwell, my attorney of 30 years, competent, dry, and unfailingly blunt. The other was to a friend who knew about private investigators, not because I wanted to stir the pot immediately, but because I needed information that hospitals and nervous family members rarely gave freely. David told me calmly to breathe and to let the hospital take its course. He said words like medical documentation and preserve evidence and do not speak to insurance companies without counsel. They were sensible words. He asked me what I suspected. I told him nothing and everything. In the days that followed, Christmas lights gave way to a quieter reality. Helen recovered slowly. Her memory of the night was patchy and frightened. She could not account for the taste in her mouth before she fainted. Jessica fared well under scrutiny, the way someone with rehearsed grief fares. Open hands, contrition, statements about I don't know what happened and we're also scared. Michael took to sleeping on their couch and telling anyone who would listen that he had been rattled by what had occurred and that he loved his mother dearly. I looked at the balance sheets. You know, when you're in business, you learn that the front page of a ledger can be very different from the footnotes. What looks prosperous might be carrying the weight of unseen liabilities. I had lent Michael money when the interest rates rose. I had co-signed a short-term loan when a business plan failed. I paid for braces when the first child came and organized unnamed bailouts when some bad decision grew legs and started walking down the street. Altruism and guilt are twin currencies in families. I had not exactly been stingy, but generosity, as anyone with experience in mergers and acquisitions can tell you, is cheap compared to the cost of not protecting what is yours. I found overdrafts and credit notices and mortgage refinances done with the sort of optimism that collapses under scrutiny. It was not evidence of a crime to be in debt. It was motive. I did not flinch at motive. Motive is not proof. Motive is a reason to look harder. I hired Patricia Williams, a private investigator who smelled of coffee and determination. Patricia is not the sort of woman who makes television appearances. She does not wear sunglasses indoors. She has a habit of writing notes in a small, deliberate hand and of showing up when you least expect her to. She called me within 48 hours with a list of transactions that read like a family confession. Large withdrawals, transfers to unfamiliar accounts, a life insurance policy taken out recently with Jessica as the beneficiary. It was the sort of thing a person writes in their past tense and hopes no one reads. I did not hope. I read and I processed. There were other items in Patricia's report that made me put the kettle down and stare into the steam. Payments to a Dr. Richard Steinberg, a geriatric psychiatrist who had, according to records, provided consults and signed off on documents for several clients in the area. Small payments at first, then larger ones timed around events that any competent estate planner would find curious. Paperwork, Patricia noted, suggesting evaluations that, if endorsed, might lead to questions about competence. Questions of competence can be currency for people who wish to gain control. I will not speculate beyond what evidence showed up in Patricia's ledger. Dates, amounts, invoices that sounded like they belonged to a consulting firm. Whether Dr. Steinberg knew more than what is in his invoices was a question for another day. I am not a prosecutor by trade. I am an entrepreneur who happens to be very good at noticing patterns. The notion that a doctor might sign something that reduces a senior's autonomy felt colder than the December air. I thought of my grandmother again, and of how the elderly are often brushed aside.
The idea of being made small by paperwork felt worse than the idea of losing money. It felt like erasure. David advised restraint and action in equal measure. Protect the assets, he said. Document everything. Don't make promises you can't rescind, and for the love of God, do not sign anything under pressure. He suggested we update my estate plan, move certain liquid assets into trusts that would require multiple signatures, and create notice provisions that would alert me when anyone tried to move money or change beneficiaries. It reads dryly on paper, but these steps mean the difference between a family argument and a legal barricade. They mean time. Time is what you want when suspicion becomes a real thing. Meanwhile, Helen's toxicology was slow. Hospitals are not laboratories of conspiracy. They move at the pace of insurance and caution, not at the pace of my impatience. When the word inconclusive was replaced with indicative, I felt the room tilt. Patricia called to say she had found an online application for a life insurance policy in Jessica's name as beneficiary, taken out shortly before the holidays. I recall laughing once, a short, dry chuckle that did not reach my eyes. People do desperate things when they are cornered. Desperation looks like rage flavored with calculation. Detective Lisa Morrison arrived a week later at my townhouse. She is methodical and precise, with a face like a closed ledger. She did not smell of perfume or of fear.
She smelled of duty. It was comforting. She asked questions that were practical rather than theatrical. Times, positions, who else had access to the kitchen? She listened to my description of seeing Jessica tilt a vial and of the subtle change in her expression when I moved the glass. I told her everything, because I had decided, in the quiet that followed, that truth is a better ally than secrecy. "You're sure?" she asked. I told her I was not certain of anything, but I was sure enough to be worried. Certainty in things like this comes from hard evidence, not intuition. But intuition is where you begin. Patricia returned with a surveillance clip. Jessica moving in the kitchen, a small container in her hand. It was grainy, not dramatic. But the clip matched my memory. It matched a pattern. Detective Morrison took it and set about doing what detectives do: collect, corroborate, and wait. They asked to see my records. I gave them what I could without revealing the entire strategy David and I were developing. She was patient in a way that people get when they assume you're a witness and not a suspect. Do not mistake patience for slowness. Detective Morrison moved in a way that would make anything else feel like theater. Precise, deliberate steps that gave me the ability to act without making a scene. It is a strange thing to feel grateful for a slow and steady hand on the helm when a storm is in sight. Days turned into weeks. The holidays blurred into muted conversations and firm handshakes. I did not sleep like I used to. I stopped trusting the ordinary generosity of family. When Michael called and asked if I needed anything, I learned to listen for the tremor in his voice that betrayed more than candor. When Jessica texted with "thinking of you," the words felt like a performance. I found myself reading messages not as a mother reading for affection, but as an executive reading for risk. Patricia handed me a folder with two things that mattered most. One, a printed copy of the life insurance policy naming Jessica as beneficiary, and two, a ledger of transfers that suggested a pattern of financial bleeding. The insurance policy was recent and sizable enough to be tempting. I did not like to think of the ways grief can be monetized, but incentive is incentive. It prickles even a charitable heart. "What are you going to do?" Patricia asked me one afternoon over tea that tasted of lemon and worry. What do you do when the people you love betray you? There is an instinct to confront, to call out the accusation and watch for a flinch. But there is another instinct, equally human, to protect what is left, to secure the little things that remain yours when trust has been spent. I told her what I had already done. Notified David, updated certain accounts, moved liquid funds into structures that required 2 signatures. I authorized her to follow the money further. She asked if she could look into the payments to Dr. Steinberg. I said yes.
That is when the world of legal protections shows its seams. I had the money to hire people to do what needed doing. I had the law on my side in theory, but there are practicalities that money does not cover. The social fallout of accusing your only son, the complication of exacting justice on those who once sat at your table and shared your holidays. A week later, the phone rang while I was watering the roses in my small winter garden. The roses, absurdly, were still in bloom, a defiance of frost. The voice on the other end was Detective Morrison. She did not use the word arrest or charge. She used phrases that were precise and withholding. "We have something you should see." She asked me to come to the station. I went because there are times when you must step from the warmth of your home into a room where facts are more likely to be in charge than feelings. The file Detective Morrison put on the table was the kind of document that makes your throat go dry. It included lab reports and a notation that made me feel like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged the furniture. The toxicology results showed traces of a substance, oleander extract, the report read. It was not a flourish. It was a piece of science that was careful and cold and very, very clear. I remember the exact way the coffee on the table cooled while I sat with that report. I had read balance sheets that taught me about liabilities before. I had never read a lab report that felt like a verdict. Oleander is an herb people put in poetry and in old wives' tales. It is not something you find in a family gathering unless someone brought it with the intention for it to be there. This is where the narrative could have rent open into chaos. Evidence, true evidence, has a way of clarifying the battlefield. It is remarkable how quickly reality becomes practical when you can lay facts out and tell a story that courts can follow. Detective Morrison did something I appreciated without ceremony. She told me where we stood and what the next steps would involve. She spoke of warrants, of subpoenas, of interviews structured like chess moves. She did not overpromise. She was accurate. She said they would need more than a lab result. They would need motive, means, and opportunity. They would want to know who benefited, who had access, who might have encouraged or coerced. All of which pointed with unfortunate clarity to the people seated at my Christmas table. When I left the station that night, the roses were gone from my hands. The world felt brittle, as if the glass my grandfather had given me as a child had been set down too hard and left cracking at the edge. I walked the short way to my car and thought of Helen in her hospital bed, of Jessica's slippery face, of Michael's tired hands. I thought of small things, the way Jessica tied her scarf, the way Michael had once used the wrong fork at a formal dinner and laughed it off. People have layers.
Anger and love can coexist with selfishness. It is the human condition to be messy and irrational at the same time. I returned home and sat at my kitchen table, where the Christmas napkins had been folded into neat triangles and the crumbs of the night still hid in the corners. I poured myself a drink, not champagne, but something darker and steadier, the kind of whiskey that keeps you company without pretending to be a friend. I thought in the slow, analytic way that had served me in business. Evidence, motive, benefit. The life insurance policy, the financial transfers, the payments to Dr. Steinberg. Everything pointed toward a pattern that smelled of design. Call it confirmation bias if you like. Call it what it is, a concatenation of unlucky coincidences or a deliberate trail. The job of a good investigator is to assume nothing and let the evidence do the talking. There are things you do when you know you are being watched. You dot your I's, you cross your T's, you make sure the locks are good. I changed a password and installed a camera at the back door. Nothing dramatic, the sort of sensible things an executive will do to protect assets. But I also did something else that felt more important and more human. I sat down with Helen when she came home from the hospital, the same small woman who laughed like a hinge, and I listened. Helen told me what she remembered in pieces. The clink of glass, the sweet metallic taste at the back of her throat she could not describe, the way the world went soft at the edges before the ambulance lights came. She was frightened by the notion that someone she had known for years could do this to her. Betrayal has a way of collecting in the chest like cold. We spoke not as victims, but as two people who had shared a night and then had it changed in ways neither of us wanted to name. She squeezed my hand in a way that meant, I trust you, which is a small, enormous thing. I had not expected an ally in her. She had been a guest who might have been collateral in a plan I was only beginning to suspect. Instead, she was my witness. The house felt different after that conversation. The ornaments and the garlands, which had seemed festive, sat like props from another life. I walked through the rooms like a woman in a tableau, cataloging evidence at every turn. Stains on a napkin, a line of sugar on a counter, a phone left unlocked on a couch. I am not proud of becoming the sort of person who notices such things, but necessity breeds focus. My next call was to my financial advisor to ensure certain accounts had the right protections in place. Money, in the end, isn't the only pain you feel when it's at stake. It's the humiliation of being taken for granted, and the erosion of the quiet dignity that comes from knowing you have stewarded something through storms.
I did not want to lose what I had built, not because of pride, but because it represented years of work. the safety of grandchildren, the small philanthropic projects I had started in the community. Patricia found more. Texts between Michael and an unknown number that hinted at desperation, a payment schedule that aligned, unsettlingly, with dates when my attention had been elsewhere. Jessica's credit history had grown more tangled in the months leading up to the party. Detective Morrison requested bank statements, and we were all obliged to cooperate. It felt at times like waving files under a lamp in a smoky room and giving the secrets no place to hide. A few days after the toxicology report that mentioned oleander extract, personnel at the hospital found further traces that corroborated the first test. Scientific language is an odd companion. It is precise and blind to sentiment. It treats betrayal as a variable to be measured. The word oleander was small on the page, but heavy with implication. There is a civic reassurance when science can point in a direction. There is also a private coldness, as if your life has been turned into a case number. I sat at my desk and looked at the face of my son in photographs, the day he graduated, the way his hair blew in the wind. He was still my child, complicated and stubborn, someone who made poor choices and who had, at times, asked for a safety net. I do not believe in easy condemnations. I do believe in accountability. There was a phrase I fell back on, the one my business partner used to throw around when crises landed like sudden storms. Control the controllables. You cannot control other people's hearts. You can control your legal protections, your access to counsel, the documentation trail. You can decide when to make a scene and when to let evidence do the sharding for you. So I began to plan. Not a trap in the melodramatic sense. There was no cinematic sting operation with dramatic music and a confession in a dimly lit living room. My plan was quieter, more methodical. It involved preserving evidence, ensuring trusts were bulletproof, authorizing Patricia to follow the money and the receipts, and giving Detective Morrison whatever she needed. It involved setting up a paper trail that could not be simply dismissed as coincidence. It involved ensuring that if anyone tried to claim incompetence on my part, the law would find I had been prudent and aware. There were moral calculations. We could have called the whole thing off and quietly given Michael and Jessica enough to survive. The human calculus of mercy versus justice is not simple. I had held families together with loans and favors before. I had hoped that generosity would be reciprocated with care. But there is a line between charity and being taken advantage of. When someone you love and have supported appears to plan your harm, the scales begin to tilt.
Some nights I woke imagining a courtroom, and others I woke remembering a Christmas tree and a chipped glass. The two images did not fit easily together. I found that strength is less about being unassailable and more about being persistent. One afternoon, while reviewing invoices and bank statements at my kitchen table, the phone rang. It was Detective Morrison again. She said we had confirmation. The lab had found oleander extract not only in Helen's blood, but in a residue swabbed from the mouth of the chipped glass. She did not add commentary beyond stating the facts. She knew enough to let the significance stand on its own weight. I felt in that moment an ordinary kind of vindication. Not the hunter's cry of victory, but the quiet validation that the unease I'd felt was not some fancy of age. Evidence can be both cold and fierce. It does not comfort, but it clarifies. The confirmation was not the end. It was the beginning of a very long and careful process. There were still questions to be answered about intent, about who knew what and when, about the payments to Dr. Steinberg and the life insurance policy that had seemed to appear around the holidays. There were legal mechanics to set in motion and social consequences to consider. There were phone calls to make and people to meet. I sat with the file and thought about the roses in my garden. They seemed perversely like a metaphor for resilience, tender in winter, but still blooming for reasons only they know. I thought of Helen's hand in mine, and of Detective Morrison's steady, blunt voice. I thought of David's dry counsel and Patricia's small-handed notes. I thought too of Michael as a son who might still be redeemable, though the path to that would be complicated and paved with consequences. By the time darkness fell over the house, I had decided on my next steps. I would tighten the legal protections. I would let Detective Morrison and her colleagues continue their work, while Patricia traced the payments back until she hit names that mattered. I would speak to no one outside the circle of those who needed to know. I would keep my face calm at future family gatherings and my voice measured.
Most of all, I decided I would not let fear make me small. There is a peculiar form of theft that happens when someone takes your autonomy from you. They do not always steal money. Sometimes they try to steal the narrative of your life. I would not let them. As I closed the file and turned off the lights, I thought of the chipped glass, resting now in a cabinet where I keep things that are both ordinary and a little holy. Old photographs, my grandmother's brooch, a small silver spoon. I had given that glass away in a moment of quiet strategy, and in return I had a truth I could not have bought. Proof. Proof is not justice. It is the raw material of justice. Outside, a neighbor set off a string of small, foolish, celebratory fireworks.
The sound made me startle and then laugh, a short, brittle sound. In my mind, I could see the map of the next few months unfolding. Motions filed, subpoenas issued, cross-examinations, the slow, terrible arithmetic of guilt and consequence. There would be hearings. There would be a public unspooling of private betrayal. And there would be choices to make about how to live on the other side of all of it. I did not sleep that night, not fully. I lay awake thinking of roses and tiny vials and small, decisive gestures. I thought of the way Jessica's face had smoothed when I took the glass from her, and how that small, almost imperceptible slip had given me everything I needed to begin to be dangerous in the only way I had left, by being clear, by documenting, and by letting the law do what it is designed to do. The next morning, the world would be open to me in a way it had not been since the night in the living room. The chip in the glass had been a small thing. It had been the hinge on which an entire life turned. I made myself a coffee, watched the steam rise, and began to make the calls that would set the rest into motion. The calls that followed were small, precise detonations. David wanted the documents sealed and copied. Detective Morrison wanted our cooperation and a little patience. Patricia wanted unrestricted access to bank accounts and the permission to follow people. I gave all of them what they needed and kept my mouth shut about the one thing I had decided would be my lever: appearance. There is a kind of theater to pretending to be helpless. I had watched enough boardroom performances to know how to play a part convincingly. I could look wobbly and worried without actually giving anything away. If the goal was to lure whoever had been planning to take advantage of me into making mistakes, then I had to show the possibility of a soft sell, a chance to step in, to be helpful, to appear necessary. So I sat at family dinners and I spoke softly about getting older and not wanting to be a burden. I let Michael see me make small, plausible errors, misplacing a receipt, sounding unsure about an online form. I allowed Jessica the tiny theater of graciousness she seemed to crave. It cost me privately, but it was a price I was willing to pay to see the play out. Patricia's work became a daily update of misery and inevitability. She traced transfers to a credit card company under Jessica's name, to a store of jewelry purchases, even to what looked suspiciously like tuition payments that had gone to an account with Michael's initials. She found the life insurance policy application dated the week before the party. It listed Jessica as primary beneficiary and Michael as second. The policy was large enough to matter and straightforward enough to persuade an investigator that motive existed. When I read the policy details, the ink did not sting like bile.
It just made my jaw set in a way a person gets used to when they're about to go to court. Patricia also dug into Dr. Richard Steinberg. The invoices were there, small consultations, then a couple of higher value evaluations that coincided with moments of family crisis. She found a pattern of quick assessments and a collection of signatures on forms that, taken together, reflected a willingness to sign competency evaluations with suspicious rapidity. Whether Dr. Steinberg had been willfully complicit in a scheme or had been careless in his practices, that was for the investigators and the state medical board to determine. What mattered to me was that the trail existed and that it could be documented. Detective Morrison moved with a patience that was almost surgical. She executed subpoenas for bank records, for insurance applications, for Dr. Steinberg's ledger. She arranged interviews and did the things detectives do when they have to stitch a narrative together that will hold in court. She built a timeline and shared it with us in pieces, enough to let David and Patricia know what we could accentuate without tipping off those we suspected. There is a strange, numbing relief in officialdom. When someone comes in a uniform trained for this and starts to make a list, witnesses, times, transactions, you stop feeling like you are the only person remembering and begin to feel like you are an input in a system that can adjudicate truth. I learned to be thankful for the bureaucracy of law enforcement because it moved in ways my private grief could not. We set the trap in the only way that would leave me intact if it failed, through legal choreography. David and I drafted a series of documents that looked, to anyone on the surface, like the beginnings of a handover. We prepared a temporary power of attorney form that, to the untrained eye and to a worried son and daughter-in-law, read like a plan for their involvement in my care. In reality, the papers contained caveats, notice provisions, and built-in time delays that would trigger alarms if anyone attempted an unauthorized transfer. I signed what a neutral notary accepted as a partial authorization, enough to let the family breathe, but not enough to move money or change beneficiaries. It is important to say here what I will not say. I did not forge signatures, bribe witnesses, or lie to law enforcement. We used the tools the law makes available to the prudent. We staged an appearance of compliance while making sure every real lever, the bank accounts, the investment custodians, the title deeds, was out of reach unless more than one party signed. I moved funds into trusts with co-trustees I could trust, David and an independent fiduciary recommended by my financial advisor. The transfers were clumsy in the way all legal protections are, tedious and full of forms, but they worked. They bought time, and time was the currency I needed. The evening we planned the meeting, my hands were steady.
We told Michael and Jessica that I wanted to finalize the temporary paperwork so the family could plan for the future. The meeting was set in a conference room at David's office. I pictured in my head the old mahogany and the quiet heating hum of a building familiar to me from years of signing contracts. Detective Morrison would be present, though not as a visible presence in the first moments. She and her team sat in a room nearby, as discreet as a good law enforcement officer must be in the middle of a case. Patricia would be watching from the back, breathing through a stack of notes. I remember how small and ordinary the room looked. Lobster painting on the wall, a pot of coffee gone cold at one end of the table. Jessica arrived early, wearing a dress pale enough to be mistaken for contrition. She kissed me on the cheek and breathed the same faint mint she always seemed to carry. Michael's face was a map of tension. There was a way his jaw held that said he had rehearsed pails of sorrow. Between my daughter's polite coughing and the nervous clinking of jewelry, the room breathed together for one small, impossible moment. David began the meeting with the sort of ritual language lawyers love. We're here to discuss temporary financial arrangements in the interest of orderly care. He was dry, and his eyes flicked toward me in a way that said, "You are safe, but be ready." I signed the partial document in front of them. I made a point, deliberately, of seeming distracted and awkward about legal language, two things that would have encouraged a well-rehearsed opportunist to believe they could press further. They did. There is a particular tone of voice greed sometimes takes, soft, pleading, cajoling in a way that feels like love. Jessica used it when she asked if there was anything I could do that would make life easier, anything that would let her help in managing my affairs. It sounded generous, and it is difficult as a mother not to be moved by a child's spouse speaking tenderly of care. But the room had already been set. Detective Morrison chose that moment to move from being a shadow to being visible. She walked in, badge unobtrusive, the kind of woman who makes it clear that the conversation's tenor has abruptly changed. I will not describe the arrests in lurid detail. They happened with the efficiency of a well-planned execution. Questions, a reading of rights, a handcuff that was not dramatic because distress had been prepped for. Patricia handed over printouts of suspicious transfers. Detective Morrison presented a copy of the insurance application and the lab reports that tied oleander extract to the residue swabbed from the tipped glass Helen had drunk from. The surveillance stills were there, grainy but aligning with my recollection and Patricia's notes. They had text too, messages between Michael and Jessica that read like someone timing the final steps of a plan. Jessica cried. Michael was quieter, folding and unfolding his hands like someone who had practiced desperation in private. The look he gave me when they led them away was complicated, a flash of apology, of fear, and I thought a small expectation that I would forgive. Forgiveness is not an obligation. It is a decision I have the right to make in my own time. After the arrests, the world contracted in legal terms. Court dates were set, bond hearings happened, statements were taken. I sat with Detective Morrison and agreed to testify about what I had seen. The tilt of a wrist, the small vial, the substitution of the glass. Helen agreed to testify, as did Patricia about the ledger findings and the life insurance policy. David and I provided the paper trail that made a jury see the constellation of motive and action rather than the lonely flicker of possibility. There is a strange ritual to sitting in court. You find yourself in a room where facts are articulated in staccato, where each piece of evidence must stand on its own legs,
and where human drama is minimized into exhibits. I found it almost a relief. The very orderliness of the process felt like an antidote to the gore of private betrayal. At trial, the toxicology results were presented as they are: testimony, lab printouts, chain of custody forms. An expert witness explained the presence of oleander extract in clinical terms, precise and measured. Detective Morrison presented texts and bank transfers. Patricia recited findings that connected dates and payments. The jury listened and took notes the way people do when asked to be the keepers of consequence. Michael's defense was, in places, a messy plea for sympathy, debts, panic, a belief that they had been cornered into decisions they did not fully appreciate. Jessica's defense hinged on denials of knowledge and an attempt to separate intent from outcome. The law prefers to parse intention carefully. It is a task built for nuance. But motive, as the prosecutors argued, is a fact of life that the jury does not have to like to consider. When the verdicts came, they were neither triumph nor consolation. The prosecutors stood and read the counts on which the jury had found guilt. Jessica was found guilty of attempted murder and related charges. Michael was found guilty of conspiracy and related financial crimes. There were also separate inquiries into the insurance claim and into Dr. Steinberg's practice, administrative investigations that threatened his license and could lead to professional and possibly criminal consequences, depending on what the health board and the state found. I will not pretend the sentences felt like closure. They felt like necessary closure of a procedural kind. Justice in the legal sense is the clearing of accounts. It is not always an answer to the deeper questions of why someone you loved chose to break you. But there is solace in the fact that the law recognized what I had feared, and that official consequence followed.
In the aftermath, the house felt lighter and heavier at once. There were fewer voices at family events, fewer polite performances. Michael's parents, who had always been part of our holiday scene, kept to their rooms in a way that felt like shame made visible. I saw Jessica once after the trial, through the glass of a visitation room. She looked smaller than I remembered, and I felt something that was part sorrow and part relief. People are complicated. The one thing the courtroom could not entirely rearrange was the private history we shared, birthdays, small kindnesses, and that remained as a ledger of warmth that complicated the calculation of anger. Helen became, to my astonishment, one of my closest allies. She and I met for tea and for afternoons in my garden long after the court documents had been signed and filed. She apologized in ways that were not necessary. There is no fault in being made a pawn. And she expressed a quiet shame at having been put in a position where her trust had been weaponized. We tended to the roses together the following spring. Her hands were small and steady, and she liked to tell me stories about her youth that made me laugh until tears leaked out. There is a tenderness in the companionship of two women who have been violated and who choose, nevertheless, to invest in one another's trust. The trust restructuring David had helped me put in place remained intact. The community accounts I had created, the notice provisions we drummed into the paperwork, and the independent trustee meant that no single person could unilaterally move my assets. It was less a fortress than a well-lit hallway, transparent, bureaucratic, visible to those who needed to know. I named Emma, my granddaughter, as a beneficiary in a way that ensured her inheritance would be managed for her benefit and not for anyone's immediate rescue. Emma was a bright, deliberate child of 12 who handled the trial with a surprising maturity. She would sit at my kitchen table and do her homework while I read legal documents across from her, the ordinary punctuation of life resuming even in the wake of disruption. There were, of course, costs. The family fractured in ways that felt irreparable in the moment. There were people who took sides and others who hid. There were friends who stopped answering my calls because the drama felt too close and inconvenient. I lost some closeness with relatives who found the truth too uncomfortable to inhabit. But I also gained clarity about who belonged in the inner circle and who was better kept at a polite distance. Dr. Steinberg faced consequences I had not fully imagined. The invoices Patricia had found were not in themselves proof of criminal intent, but the medical board launched an inquiry, and the records compelled questions about his professional ethics.
I am not a judge of all medical men. I only know that when a professional's paperwork lines up suspiciously with the timing of a vulnerable person's loss of autonomy, questions need answers. The law and the board asked them. The outcome of those inquiries is outside the narrative of my personal life, but it felt important to say. Systems, however imperfect, can, and sometimes do, respond. Time has a softening quality. The first year after the trial, I moved slowly through the seasons, careful to honor small routines. I visited Emma's school plays and tried not to stare too hard at how quickly she grew. I returned to the small philanthropic projects I had started, the ones that had nothing to do with family accounts and everything to do with people in need having a decent breakfast. It was a way to remind myself that life could be built forward as well as defended. Sometimes people ask me if I regretted not confronting Jessica in the living room that Christmas night. The answer is that I do not live in a theater of regrets. Confrontation might have felt immediately satisfactory, but it would have been theatrically satisfying and legally useless. I chose a slower, more controlled route because I had more to protect than pride. That is a pragmatic truth, unromantic, and perhaps not what people want to hear. But there is dignity in a plan that prefers documentation to fury. There were evenings, long after the legal dust settled, when I would slip into my small winter garden and sit among the roses. They had grown into a small riot of color, improbable in January, and their persistence felt like a message. You cannot control other people's choices. You can, with effort and resources, control the structures around you that keep you from being easily harmed. That is not a counsel of cynicism as much as it is a strategy born of hard experience. Occasionally, Michael would write, short messages, awkward at first, then later more cogent. Sometimes he asked for help with things he had previously asked me for in a softer voice. I set boundaries that were clear and kind. There were no grand reconciliations. There were instead gradual negotiations about what a relationship bounded by accountability could look like. I do not pretend to have loved with blind abandon thereafter. I protected myself. That protection allowed me to measure my love in ways that did not leave me empty. Jessica, after her conviction, sent a letter that read like a mixture of contrition and rationalization. It was a reminder of the odd intimacy crime creates. You have someone's full attention only at the price of their ruin. I read the letter once, then sealed it in a drawer with the chipped glass. I am old enough to know that forgiveness is neither a show nor a requirement. It is a gift you give on your own terms, and I had learned to keep gifts for when I felt they were earned and not coerced.
In the quiet years that followed, the town would sometimes whisper about what had happened at my Christmas party. There were people who believed my version of events, and others who thought I had been too careful in my telling. Both camps are a part of living publicly. I do not live for their verdicts. I live for small, ordinary things. The smell of coffee in the morning, Emma's laughter at something small I said, the way Helen's hand finds mine at the farmer's market. If you asked me what I learned from being betrayed by my own family, I would say this. Survival is not always about how loudly you make your pain known. Sometimes it is about how carefully you document the facts and how relentlessly you protect the future of those who depend on you. The law is not a poetic instrument. It is a tool. It can be precise and dull. It can make the small things legal and thereby meaningful in a way feelings alone cannot. There is another lesson, quieter, about the risks of untethered generosity. I was not cruel to my son. I had helped when he needed help. I had been patient when others might have been impatient. None of that excuses wrongdoing. None of it makes betrayal less sharp. But it taught me something about compartmentalizing charity and securing one's life against the possibility that kindness will be counted as an opportunity rather than a grace. People sometimes ask if I would have done anything differently. Perhaps I would have been more vigilant about earlier financial signs. Perhaps I would have asked different questions before co-signing loans. Hindsight has that clarity. But regret is a luxury that can freeze you in place. Better, I think, to take the painful lessons and to build protection so you can keep giving without being hollowed out. On the second spring after the arrests, I organized a small dinner for people I trusted. David, Patricia, Helen, Detective Morrison in civilian clothes, because she liked to be somewhere where she could relax for a few hours. Emma set the table with a solemnity that made me laugh. We ate simply, roast chicken and green beans, a simple apple tart, and I found myself feeling unexpectedly a peace that was not loud but steady. After dessert, Helen stood and raised her glass. "To endings that let us begin again," she said, and we all, each of us carrying our own kind of bruise, lifted our cups. I thought of the chipped glass turned quietly into evidence, of the way small things can pivot a life, of the stubbornness of roses blooming against frost. I thought of the life I had built, not for its money or its accolades, but for the continuity it provided my granddaughter.
That continuity mattered more than anything else. The case remained in the public record. The petitions to reform Dr. Steinberg's practice went forward. The insurance company fought in court, as they often do, and settled in a way that provided restitution where it could.
The trust structures I had put into place prevented any further attempt to raid accounts or to redistribute assets improperly. Those mechanisms do not feel like romance. They feel like a brick wall, and sometimes a brick wall is exactly what you need. I do not tell this story to brag or to gloat. I tell it because it is possible, even at 70, to be both vulnerable and capable. I tell it because elder exploitation is real, and because it often proceeds under a cloud of family obligation that can make the signs difficult to see. I tell it because for every person who shook my hand and said, "I would never," there were others who, like me, had glimpses of oddness and did not know how to translate them into protection. In the end, justice did its imperfect work. The legal consequences were administered. The family relationships were altered in ways that would not fully heal overnight. But I found a steady rhythm again. Tea with Helen, homework afternoons with Emma, quiet afternoons managing the foundation projects that mattered to me. The roses continued to bloom in winter and spring, in ordinary rebellion that felt like hope. If there is a last thing to say, it's this: keep your documents close, your lawyers competent, and your eyes open. Not because the world is cruel at every turn, but because sometimes the people we love are also capable of choosing darkness. Protection is not mistrust. It is prudence. It is the kind of care we give ourselves so we can keep giving to others without losing what we are. If my story resonates with you, or you have had a brush with betrayal in your own life, leave a comment. I'm grateful for the conversations that help turn private caution into public awareness. And if you want to hear other stories about resilience and about using the tools of law and grit to reclaim a life, subscribe for more.